Hi, I'm Don Reed, and this is the second of two videos on marriage and family according to Lambeth. The focus of the two videos really is on Lambeth 1998 Resolution 110. And we're going to ask three questions. What happened, why did it happen, and how did it happen? The first video really was about what happened. A second question is, why did this happen? And I want to suggest three possibilities, but this is pure speculation, so I'm not going to spend time in this video defending the 3 points. One is that same-sex unions as an issue is just unique. And so the bishops made a stand and changed the direction because this issue is special. A second possibility is that this was just the last straw. Bishops were concerned before this point, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was enough to make the bishops say, no, we've got to change course. The third possibility is that it was just a coincidence that the bishops changed course on this particular one of the 6 facets of traditional marriage. A coincidence that they changed on same-sex unions rather than earlier, which would have been on the question of women's ordination. I want to suggest to you that all 3 of these has some plausibility, and rather than spend time trying to work out which one is better, I'm going to leave this for your consideration. So what I'd like to turn your attention to is the question of how this happened. That's what this second video is about. How did it happen then in the plenary debate? The subsection report was amended, a subsection report that said we have to confess that we disagree about human sexuality across the communion, was amended to say homosexual practice is incompatible with Scripture and we cannot endorse the blessing of same-sex unions or the ordination of practicing homosexuals. How did that happen? That's what the second video is about. If we look at this graph from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, we see the gist of the story. Namely, in 1900, 82% of the Anglicans in the world were in Great Britain, and 1% in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Episcopal Church about 5%. But by 2005, the world Anglican population is 33% in Great Britain, 55% in sub-Saharan Africa. What's happened in the US? We're down from 5% to 3% in the Episcopal Church. Then if you look at a population breakdown in numbers in millions, you notice that from 1900 to 1970, in most of the parts of the world listed by the Pew Forum, in drawing on research from the World Christian Database, you see that in most of the parts of the world, there's an increase in Anglicans, 1900 to 1970. In the Asia-Pacific, a decrease. However, from 1970 to 2005, in some parts of the world there's an increase in the number of Anglicans. In some parts of the world there's a decrease in the number of Anglicans. And there's a pattern that's pretty obvious if you look. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa and at the Asia-Pacific, there's a marked increase in the number of Anglicans from 1970 to 2005. In sub-Saharan Africa, an increase of 450%. So in 2005, in sub-Saharan Africa, the number of Anglicans is 5.5 times what it was in 1970. In the Asia-Pacific, it's 2.4, almost 2.5 times what it was in 1970. However, in the socially progressive parts of the world, or the socially progressive parts of the Anglican Communion, there's a decrease. In Britain, a decrease of about 10% in that 35 years. In Australia and New Zealand, a decrease of about 4%. In the United States, a decrease of Anglicans by about 30%. And in Canada and Europe, a decrease by about 40%. So what's happening is that in the socially conservative parts of the Anglican Communion, the number of Anglicans is rising rapidly in the 35 years from 70 to 2005. And in the socially progressive parts of the Communion, the number of Anglicans is declining. Not as rapidly as it's increasing elsewhere, but declining in the socially progressive parts of the Communion. Part of the story I want to suggest is that there's a big change that happens in the Anglican Communion when the British Empire dissolves. And in fact, if you look specifically at the British decolonization of Africa, you can see that a lot of the decolonization is happening in the late 50s and the early 60s. So the countries that we're going to be interested in a little bit later in this video, Nigeria in 1960, Uganda in 1962, the Sudan in 1956, Tanzania in 1961, a lot of changes happening for those countries in the early to mid-1960s.